Hello and welcome to this mini lecture called The Chakras and Your Emotions. My name is Cyan Pascal. I'm the founder of the Light Collective, and we do a lot of mini lectures. We write blog posts, we give practices, sometimes full practices, which are a little bit of an expanded idea of what everyday yoga is. So if you're interested in a kind of fuller practice, a practice that draws upon breath and kriya and meditation and philosophical ideas and the energy body, then I encourage you to subscribe below, because we do our best to really give the public as much information as possible. And a lot of this information is really coming from our yoga teacher training. So we're running a 200-hour yoga teacher training where we go into real depth in the chakras. And then we've got our advanced Light Collective method, which is another amazing training where we go into a lot of practices, traditional tantric practices within the chakras. So it's a really big part of the work that we do. But I also don't want to just have it only for our teacher trainees. We're hoping that we can start to spread a more accurate understanding of the classical viewpoint of the chakras across the world to as many people who want to access it for free as possible. So I highly recommend, if you haven't already, going back and watching a little over the short history of the chakras video that we have already filmed, because this is a great lecture to give you some context as to why there is so much misinformation spread across the internet, across books from authors that you would absolutely love, Western authors, Indian authors, teacher trainings. A lot of what we're getting is inaccurate. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is the emotions and the chakras. And you may have come across, or you might in the future, if you're like, I want to keep doing more study on the chakras, you'll come across this idea that each of the chakras is related to a kind of emotional state. So it could be that you hear that the navel center is related to willpower, that the sacral center is sexuality, that the third eye is focus. There are these kinds of emotional states and ideas that in the last 100 years have become a really big part of chakra practice. And I have a couple of things to say about it. First of all, this idea was never part of the classical tantric tradition. Never. And the reason for that was the tradition was always trying to take the practitioner, the sadhaka, the tantric sadhaka, the one who practices, kind of away from their everyday attachment to their emotions and their mind. There was a sense that the tantric tradition, as much as there was a full acceptance of these ideas, that still as the yogi we were trying to transcend the limitations that come with this personalization of the emotions and the intellect. There is still a sense within the tantric tradition that we're elevating ourselves from the everyday, from the mundane emotions of everyday life. So if you go back to the tantric tradition, the chakras themselves were focal points for meditation, and there was never a kind of discussion around all of the intellectual, emotional, psychic qualities related to a chakra. It just wasn't part of the classical tradition. What happened in the 1920s was that Carl Jung, who was a brilliant psychologist, I believe he was a Swiss psychologist, and he read the work of another English Sanskrit scholar's translation of some work on the chakras. There were some mistranslations within this, but Carl Jung then utilized a whole lot of information that he had been collecting through his patients, through his work with Freud. He was a protege of Freud's, and he started to overlay Western psychological ideas onto the subtle body system of the chakras. And his work is brilliant. Like, he's an incredible academic. He's not alive now. But what happened was the work that he produced ended up turning into a book called The Psychology of Kundalini Yoga. And his series of lectures started to be spread across the world, and they started to influence people like Joseph Campbell, who is a late 20th century New Age philosopher who's written a lot of books and has become highly influential. He has also influenced Anadia Judith, who's written a couple of really influential chakra books. And the idea that emotions and the chakras are all interwoven has become part of the system itself within the West. So if you Google, you will find that each of the chakras has a specific emotion to it. So I just want to reiterate again, that wasn't the tradition. This is an innovation that's a Western innovation that's happened in the last 100 years. Now, personally, as a teacher, for a long time I taught this way, and I had to completely reassess the way I taught the chakras when I started to learn about what was accurate to the chakras and what was actually written in the classical tantras. But I still think that as a teacher, there is some validity in the idea that certain parts of the body somatically relate to emotions and relate to certain states of consciousness. So I'm not necessarily saying you have to kind of throw everything out. What I think is important is to be able to recognize what is an innovation and what is part of the tradition. So even if you did decide as a teacher or a practitioner, I still really want to work with this idea of the emotions within the chakras, just know this was not the tradition. This is something new. And look, you might be somebody who's really into new things. And I think that there is some validity in the fact that the heart center is a space of love and the space of like the deep soul self. And there is some validity in the idea that we express ourselves through the throat, and this center can have an impact on whether we speak articulately or clearly, for example. So the tradition didn't focus on these things because they're trying to elevate people away from that. But maybe there is some validity in the innovated idea around the emotions, because I would say that a lot of people probably in our modern age need to work on this kind of Carl Jung idea. It's almost like a hierarchy of needs within their psychological self. And they'll eventually get to the point where they can potentially begin to work with a more classical tantric system because they've done a whole lot of psychological and emotional work on themselves to be able to start to elevate out of it. That concludes our lecture on the chakras and your emotions. What you do with this is up to you. If you want to learn this classical tantric system of the chakras, then as I mentioned at the start of the lecture, we run yoga teacher trainings, which give a lot of information on this in a lot more detail. But otherwise, we've got a whole series of lectures on the chakras, and we're trying to kind of bust some of the common misconceptions in a hope that we can really create a more accurate understanding of what the chakras are really all about. Thanks so much for listening.